Today we are in Unit 7, Day 9, and we are going to be talking about the European front of World War II, actually looking at the battles, the strategy, and how things went there. So, European strategy, as far as the Allies went, the goal was to defeat Hitler first, beat Germany and Hitler and Italy first, before worrying about anything that was going to be happening over in the Pacific. Now, the United States was still fighting out in the Pacific during this time, but our major focus of operations was going to be on Europe first, and then we would turn our eyes to worrying about Japan. A big strategy to do this would be having a second front to the war, a Western front to the war. If you remember, Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union during this time, actually before this. And so the Soviets were already fighting against the Germans on the Eastern Front of the war. Stalin demanded a Western front to the war, one that would eventually be created in 1944 with our invasion on D-Day there. But you're going to see that is going to take a while before that happens, a lot of training and buildup before that grows. The Eastern Front of the war where the Soviets fought, we don't talk a ton about that except for Stalingrad. But no, the fighting out there was very, very brutal, and those two sides had very strong hate for each other. So you're going to see with some of these battles, large numbers of soldiers are going to surrender and be captured, and then many of them would basically be executed in camps during this time. So those two sides did not like each other at all. Now, what was the Axis strategy? Germany had a couple things that they hoped to do. One, they wanted to defeat the Soviet Union quickly. Obviously, that's not going to happen. One of their big goals would be to gain control of Soviet oil fields. Again, just like today, back then, oil was very, very important, and Germany believed that it would be very strategically to their advantage to capture that Soviet oil if they could. Also, they wanted to force Britain out of the war with a bombing campaign and use submarine warfare. Again, that would be one that they would try very, very hard to do and be largely unsuccessful. They would wage the war, it just wouldn't be successful in driving Britain out of the war or beating Britain. And their hope was to do all of this before the United States joined, because they knew once the United States really got their industrial and military strength up, once we got that to where it needed to be, that we could really turn the tide of the war. If you remember during World War I, when we entered that, it really changed the whole outlook of that war from that point on. And that's what Germany, one thing that they wanted to hopefully prevent. So objectives in Europe during this time. So you're going to see the high tide of German advance would end in 1942 as a result of the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, which we will talk more about. That was the high watermark, you could say, of Germany in Eastern Europe during this time. They would be defeated, and I forget the exact numbers off the top of my head, how many of their soldiers we would taken captive at Stalingrad, but it was an absolutely astonishing amount of their troops that would be taken captive there. Now, the British and the Americans had two objectives in 1942, so this is early on in the war. One, overcome those German submarines that were in the Atlantic causing trouble. We talked about them even being off the coast of the Outer Banks there, causing massive issues. And beginning bombing raids on the German cities. And this is going to be a huge part of this. So even though we wouldn't have that official Eastern or Western front to the war until 1944, really, something that's going to make a huge difference is these bombing raids that we are going to conduct on German cities. It even gets to the point where you can read there, we would carry out daylight strategic bombings on these military targets. And eventually this gets kind of hazed over time, and we start military targets and civilian kind of come one in the same, even though we did try to avoid civilian targets. A lot of times, again, those were together, and that was kind of unavoidable. But this bombing campaign would be very, very successful at kind of breaking the will of the German people during this time. So even though it'd be, mid-1944 before we actually invaded, these bombing campaigns would actually be very, very successful. Also, we combated German submarines using technology. We had new technology being invented during this time, such as radar, sonar, and bombing naval bases and that kind of thing. That was actually our first major focus, was bombing their naval bases, which would, of course, put pressure on the ships when you don't have a base to go back to and that kind of thing. So that was our hope with that. If you look here, you can see the leaders of World War II, especially when we talk about Europe during this time. I would say most of these people you're probably already familiar with. The big ones, Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander over in Europe, and Patton, who was a U.S. general who would achieve a lot of fame during World War II. In fact, they'd make a pretty famous movie about him later on in the 60s or 70s, I think. So review that list right there of all of those people. So we're just going to quickly look at some of the battles here over in Europe. Of course, the Battle of Britain. We mentioned that Britain, their Germans, one of their big goals was to basically bomb London and Britain into submission. So these would be air battles between Britain and Germany during this time. You're going to see London and other cities would be bombed, but the Germans were ultimately not able to defeat the British. And one of the big reasons why the Germans were not able to defeat the British is because of that plane that's pictured right there, which is the British Spitfire. The Germans were known. They made really, really good planes. The issue that their planes had is they were heavy and not as maneuverable as smaller planes. And you're going to see this is one thing that the U.S., we would run into early in the war when we were fighting against the Japanese, because they had very, very small, very maneuverable planes. Well, the British Spitfire there, as it was known, was one of these very small maneuverable planes that was kind of able to fly circles around the Germans. So with that, they were able, again, to fight back a lot against the Germans and take down a lot of German bombers. Now, this is not to say that London and the rest of Great Britain wasn't destroyed in a lot of ways, because there was a ton. I can't remember. I don't have the picture in here anymore that actually showed London after some of these bombings, and it looked in really, really bad shape. Another thing that's credited with helping Great Britain in this is the leadership of Churchill. He had this attitude of, yeah, we're getting bombed. Yeah, it stinks. But we are going to do everything that we can to defeat Germany, and we are not going to submit to what they are trying to do here. So Battle of Britain, again, that would be very unsuccessful for the Germans. It would do a lot of damage, though, to Great Britain. European theater, I have already mentioned Stalingrad and how Stalingrad was a turning point, because that would be the high water mark of the Germans in East Europe. Germans, they would attempt to take Stalingrad. Again, this was as much about the oil fields, but also as kind of like a strike, an embarrassing strike on the Soviet Union, you could say. How much pride would the Germans have if they could take the city named after Stalin in the Soviet Union? As you can see there, this battle would be fought from August of 1942 to February 1943. Eventually, in the end, the Germans would lose. But between the two sides, you would have over 2 million in combined losses. And like I previously mentioned, too, you would also have a large number of Germans taken prisoner of war as a result of this. And again, I don't remember the percentages right off the top of my head, but I know a high percentage of those soldiers ended up dying as prisoners of war, either due to starvation, exposure, whatever it might have been, they died. So again, this would be a catastrophic loss in a lot of ways for the Germans. Also in the European theater, you would have Operation Torch, where the Allied forces were working to take northern Africa back from the Germans/Italians. With this, again, this would be very, very successful for the Allies. Sicily would be occupied by the Allies in summer of 1943 in order to prepare for an invasion of not July, but Italy. And you would see the Allies would invade Italy in September of 1943, but they would actually face really tough resistance from Germany, which held northern Italy until May of 1945. So the Allies were never really able to take northern Italy until the Germans surrendered that. But the Germans really staked in there. If you know anything about the geography in northern Italy as well, it's very mountainous there and very tough terrain to fight over and be able to take that terrain in the end. But no, again, the Allies were able to quickly take through Operation Torch, Northern Africa, get that turned back over to the people that it should have been with, and then focus on Italy and Germany. I am going to show you this scene, or I want to show you this scene. You'll have to check it out on your own. I generally always show it in my class every single year. This is the D-Day scene from the movie Saving Private Ryan. And the reason that I always like to show this is because this is considered the most realistic portrayal of D-Day by the veterans that were actually present there on Omaha Beach. When Steven Spielberg filmed this, His goal, again, was to be as realistic as possible. And then after it was filmed and the movie was made, it actually screened it with World War II veterans who said that was the most realistic portrayal of what they had seen. In fact, I know when they were screening it for some, a lot of them had very intense reactions to that because it did take them basically back to being there at Omaha Beach. I will warn you, the scene, very, very realistic wartime violence and destruction. You're not required to watch this if you have any objections or just don't feel comfortable watching it, because it does portray, again, what the reality of war was during that time. But I encourage you, again, to check that out. I'm going to talk a little bit about this scene here in a couple slides about some things that you may have seen in it. But you don't have to watch it if you do not feel comfortable doing that. So, what was D-Day? It's known as Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, D-Day for Decision Day during that time. And this would be June 6, 1944, when Allied forces would defeat Germany and enter France in order to establish a Western front to the war. And again, this would be very, very important. And this is partly why Stalin wanted this Western front to the war, because now the Germans are having to fight a two-sided war on the east and on the west, which is very, very difficult in wartime to maintain and keep that up, because you have to split your army, you have to split your resources and everything like that. So this is why we did this. You will see Americans went over and trained for about 2 years over in Great Britain in preparation for this day. I highly recommend, if you have not read the book Bedford Boys, to read that book. It talks a lot about the time before the Bedford Boys fought in D-Day, but about their time over in England and all the preparation that went into that. And a lot of people don't realize, we think about D-Day and we think about it being kind of like a given that they were going to be successful. But there were a lot of questions and a lot of nervousness on the Allied side that we were not going to be successful on D-Day and what that might look like. Actually, Dwight Eisenhower had already prepared a speech that I had already written a speech that he was going to give if we were not successful in D-Day, in which he planned to resign his command as a result of that. So you can see the numbers there. It's absolutely astonishing when you actually think about the numbers. And if you watch that scene from Saving Private Ryan, when they're sitting there at the end and they're looking out at the destruction, but you just see everything that is there. It's just, again, astonishing how many people were there, how many machines and that kind of thing were there as well. You can see there are 156,000 troops deployed in this action, 4,413 Allied deaths on that day. So again, really, really big numbers for what was happening there on the Western Front. You can see Hitler had set up, it's in the green there on that map, what he called his Atlantic Wall. And again, he did this on purpose because he knew that the United States would eventually probably be getting involved in the war. So he set this up as a defense. And what that Atlantic Wall means, that all of these beaches along here were very, very heavily secured. In fact, if you go over to Europe today and go to these beaches, you will still see the evidence of what the Germans set up there, the bomb shelters and all that different things that they set up here. Now, the second map here, you can see that shows the different paths that we took on the 5 beaches that we did invade on D-Day there. And again, that was very strategic because of where it was in relation with Great Britain, which is where we would be coming from. And also that was a place that we really felt like that we could make some inroads into developing that Western front of the war. Here, when I talk about the mass amount of machines and war stuff and all that being there. This is a picture here after it, and you can just see the amount of ships there is absolutely incredible. If you've ever gotten a chance to watch the Band of Brothers miniseries or read the book, I know in the miniseries they show when the paratroopers are actually flying over and they're seeing all the ships go in, and just the astonishing number of ships that there were during that time. This is a letter I always liked here from Staff Sergeant Eugene Lawton, who wrote this afterwards, but just check this out. He says, "Long before we landed on enemy soil, I saw that here was what my years in the Army had come to. You can readily see why no one slept that night. For right here was history in the making, events taking place that kids will be reading about in future at school. Yes, I for one was proud that I had the honor of helping in my small way in this present conflict." And again, something, he says, something kids will be reading about in the future at school, which you are right now. So again, his viewpoint on that. Now, if you did watch the D-Day scene, there are a couple things to notate in that, and I'll describe them as best as possible if you did not watch the scene. Saving Private Ryan, backpacks 40 to 60 pounds. You're going to see that some soldiers did drown on D-Day once they got out of the small boats that they were in because of the massive amount of gear that they were actually carrying on their back. Again, they trained for that the best they could, but you'll find that often the packs that you train with, or at least during World War II, ended up being heavier on the actual day of battle than they were when you train. Hedgehogs. You will see on D-Day these X-type things that are set up on the beach. Those are known as hedgehog, and those are designed for high tides. So what basically it would work is it would be under the water on a high tide. So if a ship tried to come up, it would rip the bottom of the ship open. Low tides made them pointless, which is why you will see on D-Day that soldiers actually use those strategically for cover and that kind of thing to hide behind. There is a scene, a part in this scene, D-Day scene, where you see two men stand up. Obviously, we don't know German, so we don't know what they're saying. But what they are saying in it is, "Don't shoot me. I am not German. I am Czech. I didn't kill anyone. I am Czech." And this is kind of homage to when the Germans went into Czechoslovakia. They forcibly drafted a lot of the Czechoslovakian men into the German military, and this is kind of pay homage to them. Also, with the movie Saving Private Ryan, if you've never seen it, the whole movie, the rest of the movie is historical fiction, basically, where they are trying to save Private Ryan, who is one of several brothers, or the last one of several brothers that dies in World War II. This was actually kind of loosely based on a true story of the Sullivan brothers. This is where the military came up with the sole survivor policy. The Sullivan brothers were 5 brothers who were all stationed on the same Navy vessel out in the Pacific. That vessel was sank and all 5 brothers would die. So after that, the Army did come up, or the military came up with the sole survivor policy, where if you're the lone surviving sibling in a situation like that, you can actually be pulled out of battle, basically for your family's sake in this. Again, I already mentioned the deaths there that happened on D-Day. Another thing, a picture I put up there is showing you something that you would commonly see up during World War II. And I've even seen them up today as well for families that have family members fighting in war. But if you've ever heard the term a Gold Star family, this is what it's in reference to. And basically, what you do during World War II, you'd hang these up at your house, like maybe in a window. And for each blue star, that's how many family members that you had fighting in the military during that time. And then if a star was changed to gold, that meant that family member had passed away. So if you ever hear the term Gold Star families, that is what it is in reference to with that. And you're going to see during World War II, kind of like going back, it makes me think kind of about the Civil War, where you had entire families, all the sons going to fight. That would happen quite frequently during World War II as well, where every son that was willing and able to would go fight in World War II. Another thing that you will see in Saving Private Ryan is when they are searching the bodies of some of the Germans afterwards, one of them finds a Hitler Youth knife. And just to give you a little backstory on the Hitler Youth knife, this is a picture of one my wife's grandfather, he brought back from Germany after World War II. He brought back a couple things, but he brought this back, and my father-in-law showed it to me last year. I never realized he even had this. But on it, basically what the Hitler Youth knife was, is this was given once you passed specific qualifications, meant that you passed certain tests, you would be given this knife. And basically the Hitler Youth was kind of like the Boy Scouts. It was more a more militaristic and nationalistic version of the Boy Scouts for males ages 14 to 18. And they would go, you would do military training and all kinds of different stuff. And then at the end, your reward was this knife. It's very, very difficult to see on this knife, but it has an inscription that says in English, "Blood and Honor," which was the slogan of the Hitler Youth knife. This was one of those things that was very desirable by U.S. soldiers when they went over there and could actually get things and bring it back, was to get a Hitler Youth knife and bring it back as a spoil of war. The last major battle on the European theater you're going to see is going to be the Battle of the Bulge from December 1944 to January 1945. Now, this would be a major German surprise offensive launched in Belgium. Of course, Belgium is right in between Germany and France during that time. And basically, the Allies had no clue that this was coming. There were some indications, but they didn't realize the massive scale of this. And this would be, really, you can say in a lot of ways, Hitler's last major attempt to hopefully make headway and be able to crush the Western front of the war. Now, eventually, Allied forces would defeat the Germans. This battle would be given name the Battle of the Bulge because on the map here, you can kind of see how the Germans pushed in and created this huge bulge in the American line and or in the Allied line there, and that's why it gets the nickname or the name the Battle of the Bulge. Now, this would be the largest and the bloodiest battle of World War II for the United States. I highly suggest to you to check out Band of Brothers. I read the book this past summer. It's really, really good describing the Battle of the Bulge because they were there and were fighting in the Battle of the Bulge and described the conditions and how they didn't have supplies. And in fact, you had soldiers running out of ammunition there, again, because it was just such a big surprise attack on that. But with the defeat of the Germans in this, you're going to see really the rest of the war, the Germans would be in retreat mode. This is a cool picture, cool video here, story from a guy named Ed Walls, who fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And I encourage you to listen to his story. He ends up being shot by a sniper during the Battle of the Bulge. And just hearing his story is very cool. So the end of Nazi Germany, as I mentioned, after the Battle of the Bulge, the Nazis are going to be on retreat. Allied bombings that I mentioned earlier had been very, very successful and had reduced Germany's industrial capacity and ability to continue fighting the war. As the Russians, they closed in on Berlin, and one of the agreements that we made with the Russians when getting involved in the war is that they would be allowed to enter Berlin first. So our troops had to slow down while we waited for the Russians to move into Berlin. But as they moved on to Berlin on April 30th, 1945, Hitler would commit suicide, and by May 7th of 1945, the Nazi armies would surrender, and this is known as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day there. So with that, again, there is a whole lot more to World War II that I did not cover as far as battles and all of that. I just kind of hit the highlights there. But you can see the pictures there of Americans celebrating Germany surrendering at that point. But just know that now our major focus would have to turn over to the Pacific. You're going to see there's going to be a lot of anxiety by soldiers over in Europe thinking, the war is over for them, but am I going to get to go home, or am I just going to be shipped out to the Pacific to fight the Japanese over there? Because we're not close to defeating them yet. We still had some time as far as that would go. As far as your activity today, I have more instructions on this in Canvas and in the Google assignment that's in Canvas there. But what I want you to do is research the story of a World War II veteran and tell us a little bit about it. This generation, which is known as the greatest generation, is dying off very, very quickly. And I encourage you, if you know anybody, a grandparent or great-grandparent or anybody that fought in World War II, just to talk to them and hear their story. Even if they didn't necessarily fight in the war, just to hear from people that lived during that time describe what it was like, it's very eye-opening to hear that and know what they went through there. So I encourage you, again, do that, and I hope you are able to learn something and find something out interesting from these stories that you will hear as a result of that. So next class, we'll be jumping into the Pacific theater of the war. Have a good day.